It started with something as innocent as children's chalk art on a Saturday morning. My 7-year-old daughter Emma and 9-year-old son Jake were outside creating their masterpiece on our driveway. A colorful hopscotch court mixed with some impressive dinosaur drawings that Jake had been perfecting for weeks. The kids were laughing, completely absorbed in their art, when I noticed Karen from 3 houses down marching across the street with that familiar look of righteous indignation plastered across her face. Karen Henderson had been the HOA president for exactly 14 months, and in that time, she had transformed our once peaceful Willowbrook estates into what felt like a suburban police state. She was the type of person who measured her neighbor's grass with an actual ruler and sent violation notices for garbage cans left out 30 minutes past the designated time. I had learned to recognize her purposeful stride and the way she clutched her ever-present clipboard like a weapon of minor destruction. Here we go again, I thought as I watched her approach. I set down my coffee and stepped outside to intercept whatever complaint she was about to unleash on my children. Karen stopped at the edge of my driveway, her lips pursed in disapproval as she surveyed the colorful chalk creations. "This is completely unacceptable," she announced, her voice carrying that particular tone of authority that she seemed to practice in the mirror. Section 4.7 of the HOA guidelines clearly states that no modifications to driveways are permitted without prior written approval from the Architectural Review Committee. I blinked at her, genuinely confused. "Karen, it's sidewalk chalk. It washes off with the first rain." She pulled out her phone and began taking photographs from multiple angles, as if she was documenting a crime scene. Temporary or not, it's still a modification to the approved aesthetic of the neighborhood. "I'm going to have to write you up for this violation." The kids had stopped drawing and were now watching our conversation with wide eyes. Emma's bottom lip was starting to quiver, and I could see Jake's hands balling into small fists. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that escalating with Karen never led anywhere productive. "Look, I understand you have rules to enforce, but these are children playing on their own property. The chalk will be gone in a few days, and they're not hurting anyone." Karen's expression hardened. "Rules are rules. If I make exceptions for you, then everyone will want exceptions. The next thing you know, we'll have people painting murals on their driveways, and the property values will plummet." She finished taking her photos and pulled out her violation book, scribbling furiously. "You have 72 hours to remove this artwork, or I'll be forced to escalate this to the county." I watched her march back to her house, clipboard tucked under her arm like a shield. The kids looked up at me with confusion and disappointment. "She really called the police over chalk art," Jake said, his voice small. I ruffled his hair and told them to keep playing, that everything would be fine. But as I went back inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Sure enough, Monday morning brought a certified letter from the HOA formally documenting my driveway modification violation and threatening a daily fine of $50 if the chalk art wasn't removed within the specified time frame. I called Karen directly, hoping to reason with her person to person. "Karen, I really think you're overreacting here. The kids just want to play outside, and chalk art is a normal childhood activity." Her response was ice cold. "I don't care what's normal in other neighborhoods. This is Willowbrook Estates, and we have standards. If you can't follow simple rules, maybe you should consider living somewhere more suitable to your lifestyle." That comment hit differently. We had moved to Willowbrook specifically because it was supposed to be family-friendly, with good schools and safe streets for kids to play. I had paid a premium for this house precisely because I wanted my children to have the kind of childhood where they could draw with chalk on their own driveway, without it becoming a federal case. I spent the evening researching the HOA bylaws, looking for any clause that might support my position. What I found instead was a document so meticulously crafted that it gave Karen nearly unlimited power to interpret community standards as she saw fit. It was becoming clear that reasoning with her wasn't going to work. Tuesday evening, as the kids were finishing their homework, we heard a knock at the door. I opened it to find 2 police officers standing on my porch, looking slightly embarrassed. The older officer cleared his throat and pulled out a small notebook. "Sir, we received a complaint about vandalism at this address. Something about defacing property." I stared at them in disbelief. "She called 911 over chalk art?" The younger officer glanced past me toward the driveway where Emma's rainbow hopscotch court was still visible. "Is that what we're here about?" he asked his partner, clearly confused. The senior officer sighed. "Look, We have to respond to all property damage complaints. But between you and me, this seems like a neighborhood dispute that should be handled internally. Just maybe hose down the driveway to keep the peace." After they left, I stood in my living room feeling a mixture of anger and disbelief. Karen had actually called the police on my children. Not only was it a massive waste of taxpayer resources, but she had escalated a minor disagreement into something that could have genuinely scared my kids if they had been outside when the officers arrived. That night, I made some phone calls. One of the advantages of working in commercial real estate development for the past 15 years was that I had developed a network of contacts across various industries. I reached out to Marcus Chun, a civil rights attorney who specialized in HOA disputes, and explained the situation. "This is harassment, plain and simple," Marcus said after hearing the whole story. "But the tricky thing about HOA disputes is that technically, she's operating within the bylaws you agreed to when you bought the house. However, there might be some options we can explore." He agreed to review the HOA documents and get back to me with a strategy. In the meantime, I decided to try one more diplomatic approach. I organized a neighborhood barbecue for the following Saturday, hoping to rally some community support and maybe help Karen see that she was being unreasonable. The barbecue was a success in terms of turnout. Nearly every family on our street showed up, and for a few hours, Willowbrook felt like the community I had hoped it would be when we moved here. Kids were running around playing games. Parents were actually talking to each other instead of just waving from their cars, and the whole atmosphere was relaxed and friendly. Karen arrived precisely at the time listed on the invitation, dressed as if she was attending a board meeting rather than a casual neighborhood gathering. She made a beeline for me, carrying what appeared to be a freshly printed stack of documents. "I hope you're not planning to use this event as an excuse to violate any additional HOA guidelines," she said by way of greeting. "I've brought copies of the noise ordinance, the guest parking restrictions, and the outdoor cooking regulations in case anyone needs a reminder." I forced a smile. "Actually, Karen, I was hoping we could talk about finding a compromise on the chalk situation. Maybe we could designate certain times when kids can use chalk, or specific areas where it's allowed." She looked at me as if I had suggested burning down the clubhouse. "There is no compromise on rule violations. You either follow the guidelines or you face the consequences. Speaking of which, your fine started accruing yesterday since you failed to remove the chalk within the specified time frame." I glanced toward my driveway, where the faint remnants of the kids' artwork were barely visible after several days of normal wear. "Karen, you can hardly even see it anymore. Visible or not, it's still a violation." She pulled out her phone and began taking more photographs. "And now I have evidence of you hosting an unpermitted large gathering, multiple cars parked in violation of the guest space limitations, and what appears to be a barbecue grill being operated closer than 15 feet to the house structure." I felt something snap inside me. This woman had called the police on children's chalk art, was now threatening to fine me for hosting a neighborhood barbecue, and seemed determined to make my family's life miserable for reasons I couldn't begin to understand. The other neighbors had started to notice our conversation, and I could see the concern in their faces. "You know what, Karen? You want to play hardball? Fine. But remember that you started this." She smiled triumphantly, apparently interpreting my comment as surrender. "I'm glad you're finally beginning to understand how things work around here." The following Monday, I had 3 important phone calls. The first was to Marcus, who had found several procedural violations in how Karen had handled my case and believed we could challenge her authority. The second was to David Rodriguez, a friend who ran the most successful street art and mural company in the tri-state area. The third was to my real estate investment partner, who had been looking for opportunities to acquire additional properties in our area. "How quickly can you close on a residential property if the deal is right?" I asked her. "Cash deal, no contingencies? I can close in 10 days if the paperwork is clean." I spent the rest of the week quietly researching property records, HOA bylaws, and municipal ordinances. What I discovered was fascinating. While Karen had been busy micromanaging chalk art, she had missed some much more significant issues with how the HOA was being administered. More importantly, I found exactly what I needed to implement a solution that would be perfectly legal, completely compliant with all regulations, and absolutely devastating to Karen's sense of control. The house directly across from Karen's had been on the market for 6 months. The elderly owner had moved to assisted living, and the property was being sold by his children who lived out of state. It was slightly overpriced for the current market, which explained why it hadn't sold despite being in a desirable neighborhood. I made an offer 15% above asking price with a 10-day cash close and no inspection contingency. The sellers accepted immediately. While the real estate transaction was processing, I began phase 2 of my plan. I contacted David Rodriguez and explained what I wanted to do. His initial reaction was skepticism, but when I explained the budget I was working with and the artistic freedom he would have, his tone changed completely. "You want me to paint your entire driveway? Like the whole thing? The whole thing. And not just any painting. I want something spectacular. Something that makes people stop their cars to take pictures. Something that becomes a local landmark." David was quiet for a moment. "How soon do you need this done?" 2 weeks from today." "And David, I want it to be absolutely 100% legal and compliant with every applicable regulation." He laughed. "This is going to be the most interesting project I've worked on all year." The next phase required research into local municipal codes, which was where my background in commercial development really paid off. Most people don't realize that residential properties fall under different regulations than HOA guidelines when it comes to certain types of improvements. While the HOA could regulate things like paint colors and lawn decorations, they had no authority over artistic installations that fell under municipal public art provisions. What's more, I discovered that our city had recently passed an ordinance encouraging residential art installations as part of a broader initiative to promote local artists and cultural expression. Not only was what I planned to do legal, the city would actually fast-track the permitting process and provide a tax incentive for supporting local artists. I filed the appropriate paperwork with the city on Friday afternoon. By Monday morning, I had official municipal approval for a residential artistic installation on my property. The permit was ironclad and superseded any HOA authority over the project. Karen, meanwhile, was continuing her campaign of petty harassment. She had started issuing violation notices for increasingly ridiculous infractions. My garbage can was allegedly 6 inches too far from the curb. My mailbox was supposedly a 1/4 inch too tall. She even cited me for having excessive bird activity in my yard, claiming that the bird feeders I had installed were attracting too many animals and creating a disturbance. Each violation came with threats of escalating fines and legal action. Karen seemed to believe she was wearing me down, that eventually I would either conform to her impossible standards or become so frustrated that I would move away. What she didn't realize was that every petty complaint was actually providing me with additional ammunition for what was coming. The art installation began on a Wednesday morning. David arrived with his crew at exactly 8 a.m., right after the morning rush hour when Karen would be most likely to notice the activity. I had specifically requested that the work be as visible as possible, and David had planned the project accordingly. The first step was power washing and priming the entire driveway surface. This alone took most of the morning and created enough noise and activity that several neighbors came out to see what was happening. Karen appeared at her front window around 9:30, and I could see her on the phone, presumably calling every authority she could think of to complain about the noise. By noon, when the crew broke for lunch, Karen had made at least 4 phone calls to the HOA management company, 3 calls to the city code enforcement office, and 1 call to the non-emergency police line. I knew this because Marcus had advised me to document everything, and I had been recording all interactions since the chalk incident began. Karen finally marched over to confront me directly around 1 p.m., her clipboard in hand and her face red with indignation. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" she demanded. "This is completely unacceptable. You cannot just start a construction project without proper approval from the Architectural Review Committee." I smiled calmly and pulled out my municipal permit. "Actually, Karen, I have all the approvals I need. This is a city-sanctioned art installation, and it's completely within my rights as a property owner." She snatched the permit from my hands and began reading furiously. This can't be legal. The HOA has strict guidelines about modifications to driveways. The HOA guidelines don't supersede municipal ordinances," I explained patiently. "This project falls under the city's public art initiative, which takes precedence over homeowner association rules." Karen's face was turning an alarming shade of purple. "I'll put a stop to this. I'll call the city. I'll call the county. I'll call whoever I have to call." "You're welcome to try," I said. but you might want to save your energy. This is just day one. The afternoon brought the arrival of additional equipment and supplies. David's crew had been working on the design for over a week, and what they had planned was truly spectacular. The base layer was a geometric pattern of interlocking hexagons in brilliant blues and greens, designed to look like an optical illusion that seemed to shift and move as you walked past it. But that was just the foundation. Over the next 3 days, David and his team would be adding layers of detail that would transform my driveway into something that belonged in an art museum. Three-dimensional elements, metallic accents, and even some interactive features that would make the installation unique in the entire region. Karen spent the afternoon on her front porch, alternately pacing and making phone calls. I could hear fragments of increasingly agitated conversations as she tried to find someone, anyone, who would shut down my project. What she was discovering was what I had already confirmed through my research. Everything I was doing was completely legal and properly permitted. By Thursday evening, word had spread throughout the neighborhood about what was happening at my house. Cars were beginning to slow down as they passed, and several neighbors had stopped by to watch the artist's work. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with many people commenting on how beautiful and professional the installation looked. Karen's response was to double down on her harassment campaign. Thursday evening brought a new violation notice, this time claiming that the art installation was creating excessive traffic in the neighborhood and posed a safety hazard. Friday morning brought another notice about unauthorized signage because David's crew had placed small markers around the work area. Each complaint was more ridiculous than the last, and Marcus assured me that none of them had any legal merit. More importantly, Karen's increasingly erratic behavior was being documented by multiple neighbors, building a clear pattern of harassment that would be useful if we ever needed to pursue legal action against her. The real surprise came Friday afternoon when Karen discovered the second part of my plan. The house across from hers, which had been sitting empty for months, suddenly had moving trucks in the driveway and contractors working on what appeared to be a major renovation. I watched from my window as Karen marched across the street to confront the construction crew. From her body language, I could tell she was demanding to know what was happening and trying to assert her HOA authority over the project. What she didn't know yet was that the new owner of that property was my real estate investment company, and the renovation was part of a much larger plan. The installation on my driveway was completed Saturday afternoon, and the result was even more spectacular than I had hoped. What had once been a plain concrete surface was now a masterpiece of optical illusion and artistic creativity. The geometric patterns seemed to move and shift as you looked at them, creating an almost hypnotic effect that made it impossible to look away. But more than just being beautiful, the installation was designed to be perfectly compliant with every regulation Karen had ever cited. The colors were within the approved HOA palette, technically speaking. The design didn't extend beyond my property lines. There were no prohibited materials or structures. By every measure that mattered legally, my driveway art was exactly what she had demanded, completely within the rules. David's crew had also installed discrete lighting that illuminated the artwork at night, turning my driveway into a glowing beacon of artistic expression that could be seen from several blocks away. The effect was stunning, and within hours of completion, neighbors were bringing their families over to see it and take photographs. Karen's reaction was everything I had hoped for and more. She stood in her front yard, staring at my driveway with a look of absolute horror and disbelief. I could practically see her mind racing, trying to find some violation, some rule I had broken that would give her grounds to force me to remove it. The beautiful irony was that if she had simply ignored the original chalk art, none of this would have happened. Her obsession with enforcing petty rules had led directly to something far more permanent and eye-catching than anything my children could have created with sidewalk chalk. But I wasn't done yet. Sunday morning brought the final revelation. Karen emerged from her house to find a team of professional landscapers working in the yard of the house across from hers. They were installing an elaborate garden design that included several large, decorative elements that would permanently block her view of the street. More importantly, they were installing a large, professionally designed sign announcing the property's new purpose: Willowbrook Community Arts Center and Neighborhood Resource Hub. As Karen read the sign, I watched her face go through a series of expressions: confusion, realization, and finally absolute horror as she understood what had happened. The house she had been staring at from her front window for years, the property she had assumed would eventually be sold to another family she could potentially control, was now owned by someone with the resources and determination to turn it into something she couldn't regulate or complain about. The community center would be offering art classes, neighborhood mediation services, and educational workshops about homeowner rights and HOA regulations. All completely legal, properly zoned, and specifically designed to provide residents with resources to challenge unreasonable authority. Karen stood frozen in her front yard, clipboard clutched to her chest, as she slowly realized the full scope of what I had accomplished. Her petty complaints about chalk art had led to a permanent art installation in my driveway and a community resource center directly across from her house. Her attempt to use her power to intimidate me had backfired so completely that she now had to look at the evidence of her defeat every single day. The expression on her face was priceless, the dawning comprehension that her own actions had created exactly the opposite of what she wanted, and there was absolutely nothing she could do about it.